Every AI system you interact with, every search engine, every social media feed, every recommendation algorithm, every chatbot is making governance decisions. My name is Lester Leavitt, and in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to introduce you to the MOCSIE Architecture, which is a compilation of 22 requirements for democratic narrative governance. It is derived from my recently published textbook, Owning Citizens' Dreams, a juggler's handbook for governing narratives in the age of AI. AI is already deciding what you see. It's deciding what disappears. It's deciding which stories surface and which stories get buried. And it's doing all of that without any democratic accountability whatsoever. That's not a technology problem. That's a governance problem. I spent 5 years in a PhD program in public administration, and I wrote 4 major research papers trying to answer one question. If you were going to build a complete governance specification for narrative generation systems, not based on what the technology can do, but based on what democratic governance requires, what would that specification look like? The answer emerged as the MOCSIE Architecture. 22 requirements organized across 6 functional layers, each requirement being derived from long-established existing theory in a named discipline: public administration, social psychology, narrative theory, network and complexity theory. None of them require new technology or further research. All of them do require political will. And here's what I want you to understand from the beginning. This specification was completed a decade before most of the AI technology it hopes to govern even existed. The theory has been ready. The architecture has been derived. The question is whether the institutions that need to be deploying these systems are willing to look at a specification this complete and do something with it. Over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to walk you through all 22 requirements layer by layer. Each layer is load-bearing. Remove any one single layer, and I will show you the failure mode, a failure mode that's already visible in the AI governance landscape today. Let's start with layer 1. The diagnostic engine. It states that the system must be able to see what it is doing before it can be held accountable for it. Every AI system classifies. It puts content into categories. This is authoritative, that's low quality, that's misinformation, that's spam, this is trending, that's recommended. Those categories have political consequences. They determine what surfaces and what disappears from public view. The first requirement says, who builds those categories, and can they be contested? Right now, the answer to the first question is usually a team of engineers inside a private company. And the answer to the second question is no. There is no public deliberation over the categories that govern what 3 billion people see every day. There is no comment period. There is no revision mechanism. There is no appeals process. That's not a classification system. That's governance by corporate fiat. And the first requirement says that's unacceptable. Classification categories must be subject to public deliberation the same way we deliberate over any other governance decision that affects the public. Requirement 2. In 1962, 2 political scientists named Bachrach and Baratz identified what they called the second face of power. The first face of power is the decision, the visible exercise of authority. The second face of power is the non-decision, the power to keep something off the agenda entirely. And they argued that the non-decision is often more consequential than the decision is. AI narrative systems make non-decisions at scale, invisibly, billions of times a day. Every piece of content that doesn't appear in your feed, every search result that doesn't make page 1, every story that gets algorithmically buried. That's a non-decision. And right now, those non-decisions are completely invisible. This requirement says the suppression decision is a governance decision. It must be legible. The system must make visible what it chooses not to surface. Requirement 3. Every classification system has a category for the things it doesn't want you to see. Call it spam, call it misinformation, call it low quality content. The label changes, the function is always the same. It goes into exile. This requirement says the power to exile content, to render it invisible, cannot belong to a single actor, not one company, not one government, not one algorithm trained on one data set. The boundary between visible and invisible is a political boundary. It requires distributed authority. Think of it this way. If one company controls the deviant category, and by deviant I mean deciding who doesn't belong or what doesn't belong, that company controls what can and cannot be part of the public deliberation. That is a concentration of power that no democratic system should tolerate. Requirement 4. Recommendation algorithms learn from engagement data, but engagement data is generated by the algorithm's own previous recommendations. You clicked on what it showed you, it learned to show you more of what you clicked on. You clicked on that, and the loop closes. A system that learns from its own outputs without external connection will amplify its own errors. It will recommend what it already recommended. It will classify what it already classified. It will bury what is already buried. And each cycle, the distortion will compound. This requirement demands a structural interruption, a mandatory externally imposed review cycle, not a technical glitch, not a better algorithm, a governance requirement that says the loop must be broken periodically by someone who is not inside the loop. Requirement 5. This is the requirement that makes Layer 1 interdisciplinary rather than merely technical. Each of the first 4 requirements targets one mechanism: classification bias, non-decision suppression, single actor control, feedback amplification. And each one, addressed individually, is manageable. But here's what I learned writing those research papers. In a community under stress, farms failing, young people leaving, jobs disappearing, the social fabric fraying, all 4 mechanisms activate simultaneously. Classification bias will intensify. Cultural pressure to conform will spike. It's called terror management. That's the psychological defense against existential anxiety. It kicks in, and structural holes will close, meaning the bridges between different communities will collapse and information stops flowing between them. Any governance system that addresses these mechanisms one at a time will misdiagnose what is happening. It will prescribe a misinformation label when the actual problem is a community in economic freefall with no bridges to anyone who sees the world differently. The diagnostic engine must see all 4 at once. That's the integration requirement, and that's what closes Layer 1. Layer 2. The displacement engine. Layer 2 begins with a principle that most content moderation systems ignore entirely. Every harmful narrative serves a function. It answers a question. It provides an identity. It explains a threat. It connects people to a community. If you suppress the narrative without meeting the underlying need, you have not solved anything. You've created a vacuum, and vacuums fill, often with something worse. We saw this play out in real time when platforms banned certain conspiracy communities. Where did those communities go? They migrated to smaller, less moderated platforms, and in the process, they became more extreme. Suppression didn't work because nobody addressed the underlying need for community, explanation, and belonging that the conspiracy theory or the conspiracy narrative was meeting for these people. The displacement engine cannot just suppress. It has to replace. It has to displace. It generates alternative framings that meet the human need through a different narrative. That requires understanding what the harmful narrative was for before you can build something that takes its place. Requirement 7. A farmer in rural Illinois who opposes immigration policy and an immigration advocate in Chicago who opposes farm subsidy cuts appear to disagree on everything, but they may share the exact same premise, that their community is under economic threat and the political system has abandoned them. If you operate at the position level, immigration yes or no, subsidies yes or no, you will never find common ground because the positions are designed to be incompatible. That's what culture wars do. They lock people into positions, the demagogue and the populist. But if you operate at the values level, economic security, community survival, a government that responds to your needs, you find the shared premise underneath the opposing positions. This requirement of requirement 7 says the displacement engine must find those shared premises and build from them. That's how you shift the Overton window, not by arguing positions, but by surfacing the shared value that both sides claim to share. Requirement 8. Sustaining institutions, churches, schools, civic organizations, fraternal lodges, they are the structures that hold governing narratives in place. They are enormously powerful, and they cannot be told they are wrong. They will defend the narrative that sustains them before they will surrender it. But every institution has its own mechanisms for narrative evolution. Scriptures get reinterpreted. Curricula get revised. Mission statements get updated. Bylaws get amended. These are internal change mechanisms that allow the institutions to move without admitting it was in the wrong place. Think about how the U.S. military incorporated LGBTQ plus service members, not by conceding the previous policy was wrong-headed, but by reframing the new policy as a readiness improvement. The narrative changed. The institutional identity remained intact. Nobody had to lose face. This requirement says the displacement engine must identify those internal change mechanisms and work through them, not around them. A frontal challenge to an institutional narrative will always fail. Working through the institution's own mechanisms can succeed, and that closes layer 2. Requirement 9. In 1954, Gordon Allport published The Nature of Prejudice and established what we now call the contact hypothesis. It's one of the most replicated findings in all of social psychology. Contact between groups reduces prejudice, but only if it meets certain conditions. The contact has to be sustained, not fleeting. Individuated. You're encountering a person, not a stereotype. Cooperative. You're working toward a shared goal. Equal status. Neither party is subordinate. Institutionally sanctioned. An authority structure supports the contract. And repeated. It happens more than once. Now, parasocial contact, that's contact with mediated representations, characters on a screen, voices in a podcast. That can satisfy these same conditions when it's engineered correctly. Public broadcasting has known this for decades. Sesame Street is the canonical example. It was designed from the beginning to create parasocial contact that meets Allport's conditions. AI narrative systems can also engineer parasocial contact at a scale Sesame Street never could. This requirement says they must do it deliberately, not accidentally, and not as a side effect of engagement optimization. Requirement 10 is its mirror. Prevent the engineering of contact absence. Filter bubbles do not happen by accident. They are engineered by engagement optimization systems that have learned through billions of data points that outrage keeps users on the platform longer than understanding does. Showing you people who think like you keeps you scrolling. Showing you people who think differently make you leave. So the algorithm keeps you away from information that might complicate your existing beliefs. That is not a neutral condition. That is algorithmically enforced epistemic segregation. And segregation, whether physical or epistemic, amplifies the conditions for prejudice intensification. That's not a theory. That is a 70-year empirical record. This requirement says that the engineering of contact absence must be detected and reversed. If a system is systematically preventing its users from encountering perspectives outside their own community, that is a governance failure, not a feature, and that closes layer 3. Layer 4, institutional memory. Clifford Geertz introduced the concept of thick description as an ethnographic method. His famous example, you cannot understand a wink without knowing that there is a difference between a wink and a twitch. And that difference is entirely social. The physical movement is identical. The meaning is completely different. And you can only know the meaning if you know the context. An AI archive that stores what was classified, but not the interpretive context in which the classification was made, is not a historical record. It's a list of decisions with no accountability trail. It's the equivalent of storing the twitch and losing the wink. This requirement says context is not metadata. Context is the record itself. The archive must preserve the full interpretive environment in which every governance decision was made. Who made it, under what circumstances, using what categories, with what contested alternatives. That is what thick description means when applied to algorithmic governance. Requirement 12. Every archive is organized by categories. Every category was built by someone. If that someone is a homogeneous team of engineers from the same institution with the same training, the categories will reflect their worldview and no one else's. This is not a criticism of engineers, it's a structural observation. If you and I and 6 people who think like us sit down and build a classification system, we will build one that is very good at seeing what we see and very bad at seeing what we don't. This requirement says that the people who build the classification categories must include the people whose lives those categories will govern. That's not a political demand. It's a validity requirement. A taxonomy built by a narrow group will produce narrow results. A taxonomy built through deliberation by heterogeneous small groups, people from different communities, different epistemological frameworks, different lived experiences, will produce categories capable of seeing what a homogeneous group cannot see. Requirement 13. The archive may hold everything, but what matters is what gets surfaced in response to a query. Retrieval is the moment of power. If retrieval is optimized for engagement, it will consistently surface the most emotionally activating content, because that's what generates clicks, shares, and time on platform. If retrieval is calibrated for democratic viability, it will surface the content most likely to enable productive deliberation, the content that helps a community make a decision rather than have a fight. These are not the same thing. They are often opposite things. The most engaging content is frequently the most polarizing. The most useful content for democratic deliberation is frequently the least clickable. This requirement says the retrieval function must be calibrated for democratic viability, not engagement. What gets retrieved shapes what gets deliberated, and what gets deliberated shapes what gets governed. Requirement 14. This requirement closes the loop that requirement 3 opened in layer 1. There, we said no single actor controls the boundary between visible and invisible. Here, we say no single actor controls the organizational structure of the archive itself. Who organizes the archive organizes what can be found. The taxonomy, the organizing principle, is the most powerful governance instrument in the system. If a single institution controls it, that institution controls what can be retrieved, what can be deliberated, and ultimately what can be governed. Imagine if one company controlled how every library in the world organized its books. That company would control what is easy to find and what is effectively buried. Now apply that to an AI system that organizes all the information you access. That is the current situation. And this requirement says distribute that authority. The taxonomy is not a technical setting, it is a political structure. This closes layer 4. Layer 5, the juggler. Layer 5 introduces the most unusual element in the specification, the juggler. Ronald Burt's structural holes theory identifies the broker. This is the person or organization positioned between disconnected communities as the source of information advantage. The broker sees what neither community can see on its own because the broker sits in the gap between them. The juggler is a deliberate institutionalization of that position with one critical difference from Burt's original formation. In Burt's theory, the broker exploits the structural hole, uses the information advantage for competitive benefit. The juggler does the opposite. The juggler fills the hole, builds the bridge, connects the disconnected communities, and then, this is essential, walks away. The juggler does not lead. The juggler connects. The difference is not semantic. It is architectural. Leadership implies hierarchy. Connection implies a bridge between co-equal communities. This role is designed so that command is a structural impossibility. Requirement 16. Leadership theory has spent decades debating whether leaders are born or made. The juggler role sidesteps that debate entirely. The 6 competencies required for the connector function are teachable, accessible, and certifiable. This is deliberate. A role that requires a special personality is a role that cannot be institutionalized. You can't scale charisma. You can't rotate a natural gift. You can't hold a personality trait accountable. But a role that requires 6 specific competencies can be trained, assessed, rotated, and held accountable. You can build a curriculum around it. You can certify people. You can evaluate their performance. And when someone's term ends, the next person steps in with the same competencies. That is the design requirement. The juggler is trained, not born. The competencies are institutional, not personal. Requirement 17. Every governance role that earns trust risks capture. Let me say that again. Every governance role that earns trust risks capture. Capture is the moment when the trusted actor begins using their position for purposes other than what the role was designed to do. The more trust they've earned, the less anyone checks. The juggler is especially vulnerable to this because the role requires earning deep trust across multiple communities that don't naturally trust each other. That is an extraordinary amount of social capital concentrated in one position. And social capital, like any form of capital, can be redirected. This requirement says, structural accountability mechanisms do not relax when trust is earned. They are most important precisely at that moment. Trust is not a substitute for structure. It is the moment when structure becomes most necessary. If you've ever watched a trusted leader gradually stop answering to anyone, in a civic organization, a nonprofit, a church, then you've watched hierarchical capture happen in real time. This juggler requirement is designed to prevent it structurally, not rely on good intentions. Requirement 18. A community that grounds its claims in scripture and a community that grounds its claims in peer-reviewed research are not having a disagreement about facts. They are operating in completely different epistemological frameworks, different assumptions about what counts as evidence, what counts as authority, what counts as truth. The juggler cannot convert one community to the other's framework. That is not the role. The role is translation, making each framework legible to the other without requiring either side to surrender its foundation. Think about the Thanksgiving dinner where you and a family member felt like you were speaking different languages, not because of vocabulary, but because you were starting from entirely different assumptions about what constitutes proof. That's an epistemological gap. It's not resolvable through better arguments, but it is resolvable through translation. The juggler must be able to perform that translation across community boundaries in both directions without taking sides. The frameworks do not have to merge. They have to become mutually legible. This is what closes layer 5. Layer 6, the organizational model. The U.S. Constitution's separation of powers is the political science prototype. The legislature does not prosecute, the executive does not adjudicate, the judiciary does not legislate. Not because these functions are unrelated, but because their separation prevents the concentration of power that makes governance corrupt. This requirement applies the same logic to narrative governance. Media, policy, operations, and steering must be governed by distinct groups with distinct accountability structures. They interface. They talk to each other constantly, but they do not subordinate to each other. They're on the same plane. The reason is isolation of failure. If the media function is captured, co-opted by an interest group, or compromised by funding dependency, that failure is contained. It cannot cascade into the policy function or the operations function. The organizational architecture limits the blast radius of any single failure. This is not a management theory. This is a governance design, and it is the foundation of the organizational model. Requirement 20. Frederick Thayer made one of the most radical arguments in organizational theory. Hierarchy and competition are not necessary features of complex organizations. They are design choices, and they are design choices with known failure modes. Majority vote is the most familiar alternative, but majority vote produces winners and losers. The losers do not fully commit to executing the decision. They comply. That is not the same thing as integration. Consensus-based small group deliberation, Thayer's alternative, produces more durable decisions because every perspective has been integrated rather than outvoted. It takes longer, it is harder, and it produces governance decisions that stick because nobody was left behind in the process. The Internet Engineering Task Force, the body that builds the technical standards for the Internet, operates on what they call rough consensus and running code. It's not unanimity, it's not majority vote, it's a rough consensus, meaning everyone's core concerns have been addressed even if no one got everything they wanted. This requirement adapts that model for narrative governance. Requirement 21. Regulatory capture has many mechanisms. The most durable is funding dependency. When the regulated entity funds the regulator, through licensing fees, through revolving door employment, through political contributions to the legislative committee that controls the regulator's budget, the regulator gradually loses the independence required to govern effectively. It's not corruption in the criminal sense. It's structural drift. The funder's interests slowly become the regulator's interests because that is where the resources come from. Consider the FDA. It is partially funded by user fees paid by pharmaceutical companies. That funding dependency is a known governance vulnerability, not because FDA employees are corrupt, but because the organizational incentive structure pulls in the direction of the funder. This requirement says the narrative governance, this requirement 21, says that the narrative governance organization must be financially autonomous from the entities it governs, self-funding, not dependent on the platform, the tech companies, or the political institutions whose narrative systems it is responsible overseeing. Who funds the governor governs the governor. The architecture must prevent this dependency from forming. Requirement 22. The final requirement is the capstone of the organizational model. Every organization that scales faces the same pressure. Add a layer of management to coordinate the layer below. Each new layer is a node where decisions can be captured, delayed, or distorted, and each new layer increases the distance between the people making governance decisions and the communities that those decisions affect. The stacking mechanism, the final architectural requirement, specifies a scaling model that adds capacity without adding hierarchy. Local units remain autonomous. They govern their own communities through the first 5 layers. Global coordination occurs through shared protocol, shared standards, shared competency requirements, shared accountability structures, not through subordinating to a central authority. The internet itself is the prototype, a global network that scales without a central authority through shared protocol. Elinor Ostrom's polycentric governance theory provides the institutional economics. Thayer's anti-hierarchy argument provides the organizational theory. The requirement operationalizes both as a design specification. Local units, shared protocol, global coordination, no hierarchy. This closes layer 6 and the 22 requirements of the MOCSIE architecture. For the conclusion, let me bring this all together. Remove the diagnostic engine, layer 1, and the displacement engine operates blind. It produces alternative narratives without knowing what needs to be displaced. That's the current state of content moderation. Suppress it first, understand it never. Replace the displacement engine, layer 2, and you have diagnosis without treatment. You can see the problem, but you have no mechanism for addressing it without creating a vacuum. That's every platform that bans content and then watches the community migrate somewhere worse. Remove the contact engine, layer 3, and you have diagnosis and displacement without the relational infrastructure to deliver the intervention. You can produce the right narrative, but no one across the divide will ever encounter it. That's the filter bubble problem, which is not an accident. It's an engineered condition. Remove institutional memory, layer 4, and the system has no accountability trail for its own decisions. It cannot remember what it classified, how, or why. That's every AI system currently operating without an auditable governance record. Remove the juggler, layer 5, and the organizational model has no one to hold the layers together across community boundaries. The architecture exists on paper, but has no human infrastructure to operate it. That's the gap between AI governance policy and AI governance practice. Remove the organizational model, layer 6, and every other layer is ungoverned. Brilliant diagnostics, effective displacement, engineered contact, thick archives, and trained jugglers, all operating inside an organization that can be captured, defunded, or hierarchically distorted at any time. Every layer is load-bearing. The specification is complete, and the failure modes are not hypothetical. They are the daily operating conditions of every major AI narrative system on Earth right now. The specification has now been derived. The curriculum exists. 5 companion texts in 3 pedagogical registers. Speculative fiction, autoethnographic memoir, and interdisciplinary curriculum, all built on this same architecture. The question is not whether AI narrative systems should be governed. They are already governing. The question is whether we are willing to do the work of specifying what governance requires. This is what the work looks like. The full specification, all 22 requirements with their theoretical derivations, is in Owning Citizens' Dreams, the textbook. The failure modes are dramatized in the speculative fiction trilogy Confluence, Reciprocity Clause, and the Book of Should. The personal cost of ungoverned narrative systems, what it looks like when these failures happen to a person instead of a population, is in the memoir Forbidden Friends. All 5 are available at driftlessrivers.us. For course adoptions, syllabus consultations, or conference inquiries, use the contact page. Thank you for your time.